Hello, guys. It is time. I have been working, probably about 2 weeks now, on a top 10 invasions meta list. You all want to know what are the best invasion weapons in the game, and that is what I'm going to bring you today. And before we get to the weapons themselves, we really need to talk about invading, which, as it turns out, that's really complicated. You see, when I started working on the list, I realized, hey, I could get this done pretty fast. I just pick 10 weapons that I think are pretty good, put them in an order that sounds about right, give them a description, and I'm done. And I think that's what the majority of top 10 lists really come out to be, except you get a few lists that are really good because the person who created the list has a ton of experience, and more importantly, that person has a complex, abstract understanding of the game, and that's what I want to offer you today. So before we talk about those weapons, we're going to talk a little bit about my understanding of invasions and how you would tier weapons in the most difficult situations. Okay, well, let's get started. So the first thing I want to point out is that an invasion tier list looks very different from a duel tier list. In duels, you're looking for weapons that chip your opponents down. They're very fast, and they're too fast for your opponent to react to. They should have good range. They should have good damage. They should be able to deal chip damage through shields. That's a typical duel tier list. Now, an invasion tier list has a very different environment. So the host goes into a match and they're not using Dark Lothric sword. You know why? Because the host is fighting the computer too, right? Do you really want to use Dark Lothric sword against a Harald Knight? Harald Knight, by the way, they're resistant to dark damage. You will deal no damage to them at all, right? So you're not going to run into people using like Dark Lothric sword. You're going to run into people using stuff like Leto's Great Hammer, the Ringed Knight Ultra Great Swords, any number of the great swords actually. They're all very popular. Farron Great Sword, for example, very, very popular. I'm not saying you don't run into straight swords, but I'm saying the majority of the weapons that you're going to run into are going to be ultra weapons or great swords, or you don't see halberds too often actually. And often the host has a buddy with him, and the buddy's loadout is designed to kill you, the invader, right? You have the host who wants to finish the match, and his buddies, the summons, who are there to help kill you, because that's fun for them, is protecting the host, okay? You run into those groups all the time. And in fact, that term we use, gank squad, doesn't always apply to a group that has been strategically set up to defeat the invader. Sometimes it's just a group of 4 people having fun, right? And you're the invader and they want to kill you. So it's not always so strategic and planned out, but it is still very difficult to fight those 4 people. So what does it mean when you have 4 opponents and they're not using dual tier weapons? What are they using? They're using great hammers, great swords, and great axes, right? And normally in a duel, you'd say, I'm just going to react to everything. Good game, right? Well, not in an invasion. That's what I've learned. Not in an invasion. The reason why is because your opponents will surround you and they will delay their moves, not on purpose, it just happens, right? One person will use their R1 and a moment later, the other person will set up their R1 and essentially you'll be roll caught. You're going to react to the guy who's swaying first and then get roll caught by the guy who's swaying second. And once you're stunned, it's all over, right? Once you're stunned, everybody in the game quickly surrounds you. It only takes like a split second. They all catch up and they all start wailing into you and it one-shots you and the invasion is over. I can't tell you how many times I've died that way and how long it took me to develop, kind of a sense of the play style to avoid having that happen, right? So a lot of invading is just staying out of range of the group. You want to be able to harass the group. That's a term I use a lot, is you want to be able to harass them, but you don't want to directly fight them because you will be quickly outmatched. Even just by 2 people, it can be very difficult to just go into the fight and fight them as if you're dueling them. And it has everything to do with the fact that they don't have the same recovery issues that they're going to swing and not worry about recovery because their friend is protecting them with his own swings, right? It's very, very hard to punish them. And with that being said, that's why we step into ultra weapons being more valuable to an invader in invasions than they would be in duels, because you're able to do a few things with it. Let's say you're punishing your opponent who is now in his recovery frames, at the same time his friend is attacking you. Well, if you're using an ultra weapon, you're going to poise through his friend's attack and still land the move on the host and be able to roll away. Incredibly valuable. Okay, so right off the bat, we see how ultra weapons play a different role in invasions, but there's more than that, right? So, in invasions, the next thing that makes dual weapons a lot less valuable, let's talk a little bit about the Pontiff Knight Curvesword, right? So, Pontiff Knight Curvesword, absolutely terrifying in a duel, but in invasions it's very different. So you get in there, you hit him a few times, great, you did great, you outplayed him. But then his buddy shows up and you're kind of low on stamina, you gotta roll away. And what happens when you roll away? The host drinks an Estus. All that work you did with the Pontiff Knight Curvesword is wasted. And you can play this game where you're trying to wear the host out and his friend of all their Estus. It's not impossible. Some dual weapons will tier well, but my point is there's going to be ultra weapons that will outperform them. So you're going to have ultra weapons that can deal way more damage when they're punishing an Estus heal. Your opponent inevitably will heal, and you can follow them with your ultra weapon, and as soon as they drink, you hurt them for a lot of damage. You counter everything they heal, and then you leave some extra damage on top of that. You're using a Pontiff Knight Curvesword, that won't happen. You might not even counter whatever it is they healed with the Pontiff Knight Curvesword, okay? So healing plays a role. Next, we can talk about drop attacks. So drop attacks with an ultra weapon can often lead to, I use the term one-shot. When I'm referring to one-shot, it means your next move one-shots the host. Well, sometimes for that to work, the host has to be missing a little bit of health, but that happens. Sometimes the host takes a little bit of damage, but it's not enough for him to drink because he doesn't want to waste his Estus. And then you do something like land a drop attack with your Ultra Greatsword, and it's over. You've killed the host, right? All you need to do is kill the host, and it doesn't matter how many people he summoned. So drop attacks are extremely valuable, and the thing is, with those dual weapons that never use drop attacks in a duel, they don't have that good of a drop attack. That's the truth. Like, sure, they do some damage, but it's really the Grey Hammers and the Ultra Great Swords and the, curved swords. Those are the guys who deal like 900 damage in one move when you do a drop attack. They also tend to have better range, which is another important thing. When we're talking about drop attacks, range matters. Your opponent can roll twice and still get caught by your Ultra Great Sword, right? That's good, but that's not going to happen if you're using, like, I don't know, the S-Stock. You know what I mean? Building on that idea of the one-shot drop attack, the ultra weapons tend to do higher damage anyways, so if you're skilled with an ultra weapon, you'll find yourself in positions where you can finish an opponent off, two-shot them, or just one-shot them if they're missing health already because they're fighting an AI, for example. That happens all the time. You have these situations where you're suddenly able to kill a phantom, a summon, before they can heal up. Remember, the host and his buddies have like 25 Estus together. You've got 5 Estus. You can't win a war of attrition with them. It won't work. You really do need to be able to finish them off quickly. So high damage is really valued over just maybe like speed, right? S-Stock versus an Ultra Great Sword. The Ultra Great Sword's more valuable to the invader. That's the truth. Okay, and building on, Estus, I want to mention Ashen Estus, which actually becomes super valuable in invasions as well, because it gives you access to one of the best miracles in the game, a miracle that only gets better when you're an invader. We're talking about Tears of Denial. When you're fighting a bunch of guys who are using ultra weapons, which is often the case when you fight a gank squad, they get in, let's say 2 of them get in 4 hits. That's going to break your tears but not kill you, and they're not going to have a good enough running attack to necessarily catch you and finish you off. So you run away, you run into the AI, past the AI, you drink up, and you use your Ashen Estus to reapply tears, and you are golden, you're back in the fight, right? Very different. There's no way you could do that in duels. So Tears of Denial goes from good to amazing in invasions, and you can only access Tears of Denial if you have your Ashen Estus. So we've run into this really interesting problem with Ashen Estus where caster builds, that is dedicated caster builds, this would be builds that use like sorcery, demon scar, pyromancy, right? Or like pure cleric builds, which I think the cleric builds surprisingly are the most viable because they have access to one of the best spells in the game for invasions, Wrath of the Gods. It's crazy deadly near bridges, right? Well, my point is, when you have to split your Ashen Estus and your Estus to consider being able to cast throughout your fight, the truth is, maybe in a 2v1, or maybe if you're fighting really bad players, you're going to do fine, right? You can say the Demon Scar is even very high tier for duels. I thought it was great. But if you're in truly the most difficult contest between a gank squad that knows what they're doing, and you're the invader using Demon Scar, the fact is you're going to run out of Ashen Estus. You might even kill one of them and get one Ashen Estus back, but they're going to make you waste that Ashen Estus faster than you gain it back. That is a serious problem for caster builds and invasions, and is why none of them made the top 10 list. Again, Demon Scar can be considered very high tier. I thought it performed very well. I actually played with it for a number of hours while I was working on this list. I've worked with Demon Scar and invasions before. I've played around with all of the major caster builds and invasions, and just the fact that you have to have fewer Estus to bring more Ashen Estus, just the fact that you've got to give up your attunement from Tears of Denial to whatever it is you're casting, right? Tears of Denial costs 2 attunement slots. So if you're a caster, you usually don't have it. And the fact that you're going to lose out slowly all of your Ashen Estus versus a competent group, that's why caster builds don't make it onto the list. Okay, well, I've pretty much gone over kind of the defining aspects of invasions that I wanted to talk about. Now let's define this upcoming tier list. The first thing I want to mention, I'm invading at SL 125. I get a lot of action around the boss areas. If I was invading at really low levels or really high levels, the tier list might be different. I want to mention also that I looked a lot at the data for these weapons, including the range and the damage that they receive. Also, their access to a particular weapon that didn't make the list, but it almost did, called Chaos Dagger. The reason Chaos Dagger didn't make the list is because technically you don't use it as a primary, you use it with the Hornet Ring to deal insane amounts of riposte damage. And so any weapon that has access to Chaos Dagger actually ranks higher than its non-Chaos Dagger counterpart, right? So Chaos Dagger ended up being a defining part of the list, even though it's not on the list. Okay, and with all that being said, I just want to mention I have much more to say about invasions, but the video here is going to get too long if I keep going on, so we're going to get over to the weapons. Please remember, this is, in the end, this is my opinion. There's no reason to get real upset with any of the choices I made. If you disagree with what's on the list or what's not on the list, just tell me in the comment section, have a conversation about it with me. I can share my thoughts on it, and most of all, enjoy. I hope you guys enjoy the list. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start the list. Coming in at number 10, we have the Millwood Greatbow. Millwood Greatbow is the only truly ranged weapon on the list. Every arrow, you can bring about 100 arrows, which is plenty, and you're not going to have to use your FP in order to keep shooting this bow unless you're using the weapon art. So you need to use the weapon art strategically, not to waste too much of your FP, which you should be saving for Tears of Denial, right? Now really what makes this so effective as a primary weapon is just that you're not going to engage your opponents in a close range fight. Anytime they're running at you and they want to surround you, you're just going to hightail it the whole game, and you're going to pull your opponents into the AI and let the AI be your damage output, basically. Your opponent's going to have to deal with the AI if they come in too deep after you, and then you're going to be shooting them with the bow while they're trying to fight the AI. And it's a very powerful combination because for you, the risk is very low, whereas for them, the risk, depending on what they're fighting, the risk is very high, especially if you start to bait them near ledges and on top of bridges. It gets really, really dangerous really fast. The bow comes in last place because you're not really able to pressure the host. So if the host wanted to give you the bird, he could just turn his back on you, go all the way back to the bonfire, sit down, and both of you could do that for 3 hours, right? Until you decide, he's just not coming down, I guess I'll Black Crystal out. You could go up into the room and contest him, right? But if you're actually fighting a group of 4 people who are camping the bonfire, you're not going to win that with the Greatbow. So that's why Greatbow comes in 10th place, because it can't truly pressure, right? But it can harass incredibly well, maybe the best harass in the game, because it's so deadly, being able to knock an opponent off, the side of a ledge from a totally safe distance. And this is a strength weapon, so it doesn't have access to Chaos Dagger. It does have access to Man Serpent Hatchet, which you can infuse to heavy. So Man Serpent Hatchet is going to get that shield chip damage. That is nice, it's useful. I found that having Man Serpent Hatchet with me allowed me to follow up sometimes after landing an arrow on an opponent who otherwise would have ran away and drank an Estus. The other nice thing is the Millwood bow can be used either with the Leto Great Hammer or with the FUME Ultra Great Sword. So there are some pure strength weapons that the Millwood bow actually pairs very well with. And that's going to do it for rank 10. Coming in at number 9, we have the Corvian Great Scythe. The Corvian Reaper really has two things going for it. The first thing it does extremely well is cut right through Great Shields, and believe it or not, you run into a lot of Great Shields in invasions, right? Not so much in duels. You run into a Great Shield every now and then in duels. They're kind of, I'd even call them rare. But in invasions, people use those Great Shields to fight the mobs, right? The AI. And so you run into Havel's Shield, you run into Yorm's Shield. And the trouble is, if you try to fight them with your regular weapon, they're actually pretty effective for crowding. Great Shields can actually allow one player to pressure you really hard while his buddies try to surround you. He can't do that versus the Corvian Reaper, the Corvian Great Scythe. So Corvian Great Scythe deals a lot of pierce damage to Great Shields. On top of that, you're going to bring the Chaos Dagger and the Hornet Ring, and this is going to allow you to one-shot your opponents if you break their guard. So the Corvian Great Scythe becomes an extremely deadly anti-Great Shield weapon. If you're able to access it on the build that you're using, maybe you have like a straight sword build, you could always hard swap over to it in order to use that instead of your straight sword. Now, the other thing Corvian Great Scythe really has going for it, its neutral two-hand R1 range is 27 spaces, which is longer than just about, I believe, all the spears in the game, depending on what move you're using. But if you're just talking like R1, yeah, it's longer than a spear, guys. And that's extremely useful for outspacing ultras, right? You fight ultras all the time. They're hard to outspace with the short weapons. They're not hard to outspace with the Corvian Reaper. So that is how that weapon made it into rank 9. Originally I'd given it an A- or something like that. I gave it an A ranking. And when I came back to start analyzing the weapons and I really started playing around with them and testing them again, I really started to appreciate just how powerful Corvian Reaper is. Because not only does it pierce right through shields, which you see them all the time. I mean, even if you're not talking about great shields, you see a lot of medium shields too, like the Shield of Want. They're everywhere when you're doing an invasion. But just that unusually good range and the nice sweeping arcs you get catch opponents all the time. So rank 9, Corvian Great Scythe. Up next, we have the Lothric Nightsword and a parry tool in rank 8. Now, as I warned earlier, you are going to see a lot of Chaos Dagger here. Chaos Dagger, although it's not a good primary weapon, it is insanely good at finishing opponents off. When you get a parry and you go into the riposte, nobody can hurt you during that period either. They can all surround you. It doesn't matter. You're going to get the one shot on whoever you hit. Because usually what's going on here, you might have parried them, but a lot of the times you're also breaking their guard. And when you break their guard, you're dealing that chip damage to them because you've got a dark infusion on your weapon. Think about the Great Corvian Scythe that I was just talking about. When you actually guard break them with the Great Corvian Scythe, you're going to deal a lot of chip damage first. So this is a terrific way to finish opponents off very quickly. And of course, if they're skilled, they know you want to get the parry. You use that kind of like as a psychological tool as well. You don't necessarily have to go for the parry, just have it be there, have it be a threat. You could use the Black Knight Shield just like in a duel, but actually if you catch somebody who is spamming or you catch somebody who's chasing you with the running attack, right? That happen, in a duel, where are you going to run? But in an actual invasion, you run forever, right? So you can bait them, and then finally parry their running attack and riposte them with the Chaos Dagger. On top of that, you do have a Dark Lothric Nightsword with you, which is a pretty decent weapon. It has a lot of range. The weapon art has some pretty good momentum that allows you to guard break people, right? That's useful. I wanted to mention, instead of the Dark Lothric Sword, you could also have the Dark Sword, which uses Stomp. And Stomp will actually allow you to trade with Great Hammers. I've done that myself. You could also use the Goddarts if you want to have better range and a better rolling attack. But in my opinion, I don't think the weapon art is quite as useful. I know the first part of the weapon art can't be parried on the Goddarts, but I feel like you also could just avoid being parried by not spamming, right? So yes, Dark Lothric Knightsword paired with something like Llewellyn Shield. Going for those parries with the Hornet Ring and the Chaos Dagger in reserves. It's a very basic way to invade. It's very straightforward, it's very reliable, and that's why it deserves to be on the list. Okay, moving right along, we're going to have Splitleaf in rank 7. Splitleaf is a popular dueling weapon as well. Here in Invasions, it's still really good. It gets essentially a very high AR, right? It's going to be longer than the Onyx Blade. The Onyx Blade has 21 spaces for its two-handed R1, whereas the Splitleaf has 23 spaces for its two-handed R1. So it's just a little bit longer, right? And I suppose you could probably make the argument that Onyx Blade, if you use the charged R2, it pokes probably a little bit further, but realistically, you're going to do just fine with Splitleaf, and you're going to have that very hard-hitting true combo. That true combo that really does about the damage of an ultra weapon. And of course, I'm talking about it's going to be R1, weapon art, R1, or R2, whichever one you want to click on, right? So that's going to deal about the damage of an ultra greatsword, which is really what we want in this game mode. And you're going to be able to poise through most light weapons. On top of that, this is a weapon that you can infuse to dark, which means you can bring the Chaos Dagger with the Hornet Ring. So if you guard break somebody, which isn't unreasonable because halberds deal extra stamina damage, if you didn't know that, it's not unreasonable to believe that you're going to guard break somebody. You can then go right into the riposte and finish your opponent off. Now the Splitleaf would rank a little bit higher if it could poise through ultra weapons, but I think it's forgivable. You're just going to have to be careful. I can also say that unlike some of the ultra weapons that are going to show up on this list, the Splitleaf actually has a better running attack. That's right, ultra weapons have a very slow running attack, and that running attack can even make it hard to punish Estus drinking. Splitleaf doesn't really have that big of a problem with the running attack. It comes out a little slower than some of the very fast weapons, but it comes out kind of fast too. I like the running attack better than greatswords. Another reason why this weapon is here rather than the Onyx Blade, Gales, or Claymore. Coincidentally, coming in rank 6, I've chosen the Mad King's Crucifix, or Crucifix of the Mad King, however you want to say it, right? This is an odd one, because it's actually a buffed weapon, right? So if you didn't know this about the way Crucifix of the Mad King works, as you're scaling the damage up on it, you're actually going to put points into Faith, and this is going to bring the damage up. And then what you're going to do is you're going to put a Dark Blade buff on it, because it's one of those very rare weapons that scales in Intelligence or Faith, and still allows you to buff it. So yeah, this is one of those rare weapons where you're going to bring a few more points in your attunement slot, but you're going to get really high AR. And you got to be very careful with how you apply. If you're running low on Ashen Estus and FP, you can switch over to a Pale Resin, something like that, right? But yeah, you're going to get your dark damage up high on this weapon, and then what you're looking to do is catch your opponent in the weapon art. And I'm not talking about the weapon art R2. You're going to go for this combination, this combo. You're going to go weapon art, R2, just like that, right? And what's interesting about the weapon art is it has a ton of hyper armor. It basically has the hyper armor of an ultra weapon, except on the second part of the weapon art, which is a true combo. Weapon art, that's a true combo. On the second swing, that actually resets your poise because it's considered a weapon art, right? So you reset your poise when you're spamming that weapon art, making it an incredibly powerful blending machine versus other ultras. Very few people expect it, and even when they do expect it, they get trapped by it. It's crazy. And the best part is after you've hit them for tons of damage, about 700 damage, you finish them off with the R2. Now the R2 is going to give you one of three things. It could give you the Vexation. With the Vexation, your opponent tends to run away from you, so that helps you just kind of, don't assume that obviously, but generally that's what happens, and you can have these really fun moments where you're chasing them down with the running attack and try to get the Vexation to land, and that Vexation can even knock them off of bridges. Now the other one is you could get poise, which if you get the poise, then at least you're not going to get stunned by any of their buddies around them, right? After your R2. The last one you could get, and this one's my favorite, is the Scream. The Scream just adds a ton more damage to your move, sometimes bringing your damage up to like 1200, and it knocks everyone away. It's amazing, right? So if you can adapt to just dealing with randomness on that R2, it doesn't matter which buff you get. I think they're all good. The Scream is just better than the other two. But yeah, Mad King's Crucifix, just like Splitleaf, has better range than the Greatswords. That weapon art is insanely good, and you reach very high AR with this weapon because it's one of the few weapons in the game where you really should be going with the buffed build. Alright, and now we're moving on to rank 5, the Astora Greatsword, or what it truly is, the Astora Ultra Greatsword. You know, before we go any further, let me just remind you, there's only 10 spots in this list, and I really was trying to give it to the best of the best weapons that I think could handle gank squads, right? There are a lot of very viable invasion weapons, so again, if your weapon that you like didn't make it onto the list, tell me about it. I want to hear about it, and maybe in the future, maybe I'll update the list and add that weapon, right? Okay, so moving right along, the Astora Greatsword. Here's the deal. There was a time when I was still getting into the Ultra Greatswords, and I thought, just looking at the numbers and based on what I knew about the feeling of the Astora Greatsword, see, I had a very limited understanding of all the Ultra Greatswords because I hadn't used them all. I thought it was the best Ultra Greatsword. It doesn't weigh very much. You can infuse it, so you can, infuse it to dark. It has the charge weapon art, and then I thought that the horizontal moveset was the superior moveset on Ultra Greatswords. Jump to today, and I have a lot more experience with Ultra Greatswords. I mean a lot. I use Ultra Greatswords in high tier duels, that kind of stuff, right? And I have to say, the horizontal moveset is what holds the Astora Greatsword back. It's the other way around, right? I'm not a big fan of the horizontal moveset. I can see how it would be useful if you had two opponents spread out in a narrow cone right in front of you, because then you could possibly land the R1 on both of them if one of them doesn't roll out of it. That's actually pretty rare, and the range on that horizontal moveset is pretty short when you compare the Astora Greatsword to the FUME and the Greatsword Ultra Greatsword, who have the vertical moveset and a lot more range. But the reason the Astora Greatsword does make it onto the list is because, yes, you can infuse it, yes, it does viable damage, and most importantly, it has the charge weapon art. Believe it or not, the Astora Greatsword beats a lot of other Greatswords just because of that charge weapon art. And the reason I like it so much is because you have an opponent, let's say you've just about killed him. He's just got a heartbeat of health left, right? He's getting out his fairy potion, right? He's gonna let a fairy out, or whatever, his red potion, and he is rolling for his life right now. You just go right into the charge and finish him off, and there's nothing his buddies can do about it. And after using the Astora Greatsword in a lot of invasions and a lot of duels, after a lot of practice with this weapon, I actually really value that charge weapon art. But other than that, I'm not a fan of the horizontal moveset. I don't think it's viable in duels, and it doesn't have the best rolling attack. The R2, I've always been a fan of the thrust R2, but ever since I got spoiled by the Greatsword Ultra Greatsword R2, I'm not even that impressed by the thrust R2 anymore. So yes, with the Astora Greatsword, it really does come down to how efficient the weapon is, access to the Chaos Dagger, and the powerful charge weapon art. And that's going to be the Astora Greatsword taking 5th place. Alright guys, we are on the other side of the list. We are in the top 5 weapons now, and coming in at 4th place is the FUME Greatsword Ultra Greatsword. So the FUME and the Greatsword Ultra Greatsword have the longest R1 range of any of the Ultra Greatswords, right? Comes in at 23 spaces on the vertical moveset. And speaking of that vertical moveset, besides the fact that it gets such terrific range, when you swing it a second time, it actually flies behind you. It also, when you're delaying it, it seems to have a little bit more range on the second swing. I don't know if there's any data on that, but I definitely feel like that's true. So you can set it down, delay it, let it go on the second swing, and you can catch opponents who didn't really realize quite how long that weapon can reach. Now the FUME Ultra Greatsword is a really interesting one. It's a pure physical weapon, so it's not going to have access to Chaos Dagger. It does have access to Millwood Bow, as I mentioned earlier. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about the attributes that make this weapon so unique. So the FUME Ultra Greatsword, when you're going into the stomp, it gets incredibly good damage reduction. The enemy is basically going to deal a tiny bit of chip damage to you, and what's even more interesting is, although it costs stamina to absorb that damage, you can't be guard broken. So you can actually use the stomp like a shield. And what's interesting about that is sometimes it's safer to stomp rather than roll. If you're worried about the roll not coming out fast enough, or if you're worried about being roll caught, you know, when you move into that stomp and players see it, they get nervous. They're like, oh no, he's about to use his stomp R2, right? So you go into the stomp, absorb whatever move they're about to use, you won't be guard broken, and then your opponents have to move away from you because they don't know what your next move is going to be. They don't know how much stamina you have left. So FUME Stomp is actually really valuable as a shield. And speaking of shields, it has the best guard of any weapon in the game. With 55 stability and 88% physical reduction, it's basically like a mediocre medium shield. But the thing is, that guard is so good that I actually developed my Greatsword Ultra Greatsword fighting style around the fact that you can close in on your opponent safely, to a degree safely, while guarding with these weapons. You see, you get close to your opponent while guarding, and then your opponent has to decide if they should risk attacking. They might end up trading with you. But also they have to worry about rolling backwards. You see, if they panic roll, you might actually catch their panic roll, and that has everything to do with the vertical moveset on these weapons having so much range. One backwards roll won't take them out of the range of the weapon, and that forces them to only roll to your left or your right. It's really interesting, gives you a lot more control over the fight than you would expect. And that's why I love them, honestly. That's why I like the vertical moveset on these weapons, because they roll to your left or your right, and then you charge up an R2, and they might actually break into a panic roll at that point, giving you a lot of control over the fight. So FUME, just like the Greatsword Ultra Greatsword, has the favorable moveset that I love. Some of the other nice things about FUME, it deals strike damage, which is favorable against heavy armor. It has a better rolling attack, a much better rolling attack than the Greatsword Ultra Greatsword. There is just one major problem with the FUME, and it weighs a lot, right? It weighs a ton. On the other hand, it gets great hammer poise, so reaching meaningful poise breakpoints of like 39.3 in order to poise through other ultras is easier to accomplish on this weapon. So I feel like that's a little bit of a trade-off. I think what I noticed more than anything else with the FUME is actually how expensive the stamina is, especially if you're using it to block a lot. You're not going to have a lot of stamina, so you have to be very good at managing your stamina so that you can attack but stay safe the whole time. And after that, the damage is terrific. You know, they nerfed it and it still does terrific damage. You can put on a charcoal resin, you can put on a pale resin, doesn't matter. You can put on a gold bundle, and you're going to get in the 700s of AR, which is competitive damage for an ultra weapon. Alright guys, coming in third place, top 3, is the Great Club. And of course, I really mean the Dark Great Club, right? Because what you're going to do is you're going to put on the Night Slayer ring, you're going to put on the Hornet ring, and then you're going to charge your R2s and break everyone's guard, right? All day long you're going to be breaking guard with this Great Club. It gets, of course it gets that extra stamina damage because it's a great hammer, right? And amongst great hammers, this is the best one in my opinion. You really just have 2 great hammers that are, well, you can make an argument for Spiked Mace. Spiked Mace has a very basic moveset, right? You're going to be trying to catch opponents with your R1 on the Spiked Mace, but if you do, you get this really high damage combo. So Spiked Mace, honorable mention. But in my opinion, the real competition between great hammers is between Lido and Great Club. And the problem with the Lido, besides the fact that it's very, very heavy in comparison to Great Club, it actually kind of hides your screen, and the weapon art, which is kind of the best move on the Lido, the weapon art can kind of be memorized and avoided. But also for invasions, if you're going to be using the weapon art, you're going to run out of FP, right? So if that's like your main move with the Lido, you're going to be using a lot of your FP, and that can actually affect how many times you can proc Tears of Denial. So I had to give it to the Dark Great Club, who also has access to that Chaos Dagger, is a very lightweight weapon, and it doesn't hide your screen at all, right? It has that really tricky R2 which that can be learned, just like the Leto Great Hammer's weapon art. The difference is that you can actually delay the R2. You can control when the R2 comes out with the Great Club, which I think adds a layer of reaction required from your opponent. So basically, with the Great Club, you're going to get out there, you're going to start charging your R2s, and what's nice about this weapon is if your opponent tries to punish the R2, you have the option of following up with an R1 in very low times. So in other words, the recovery frames on that R2 are very small. You can go right into the R1 defending yourself, and even using the R2 as bait. Yeah, see, opponents see the R2 come out and they go, hey, I'm going to punish that once he misses, and it turns out they're not going to do that at all because your R1 comes out very fast. So your opponent gets caught in the R1 and you've dealt a ton of damage. So it's very straightforward with this weapon. It's got a terrific drop attack. It breaks guard like nobody's business. It's got the Chaos Dagger hidden along with the Hornet Ring. You actually can put on the Night Slayer Ring if you want to deal tremendous stamina damage to a blocking opponent. I really do think it deserves third place on this list. I have wrecked so many groups with this weapon. I've taken it out invading for many hours. It's a very easy weapon. Okay, we are ever so close to first place. We are now going to take a look at rank 2, the Harald Curved Greatsword. And really, there's a lot to say about this weapon. I almost gave it first place. I also considered putting the Exile Curved Greatsword on this list, just so you know, but in order for me to do that, I would have to remove one of the other weapons from the list. So I just want to mention, while I'm working on the Harald Curved Greatsword, that Exile Curved Greatsword is also a very powerful invasion weapon. And why are they so good? Well, first of all, let's get this out of the way. You can obviously infuse both of them to dark, and that's what I recommend. And this is going to allow you to bring the Chaos Dagger, and anytime you guard break somebody, you're going to be able to one-shot them with the Hornet Ring on, right? Now the next part, we got to talk a little bit about the weapon itself. The Harald Curved Greatsword is the longest range curved sword in the game, and actually the range on that weapon is pretty scary. When I have to fight one anywhere, I get nervous. There's only a few weapons in the game that really make me nervous, and especially when it comes to ultra weapons, there truly are only one or two that scare me, and this is one of them, the Harald Curved Greatsword. It is a death machine, right? The R1 on this weapon reaches so far. If you mess up the timing of your roll just by a little bit, you will be roll caught for a ton of damage. And that's the other thing. Now, so it's got its really powerful running attack. And in my opinion, when you're doing invasions, that is one of the best moves in invasions. It's good in a different way compared to some of the other ultras that I've mentioned. Basically, I talk about this thing called harassing the enemy team. And this is one of the best harassing melee weapons in the game, because you're able to get in there with the running attack and then just get right back out, and you just keep doing that, just back and forth. Your opponent isn't skilled enough, or they're not ready, you catch them unprepared, you catch them with the running attack. That running attack has plenty of range too, horizontal range, so if there's actually two people in front of you, you catch more than one person, you catch the group, right, for lots of damage. And, if you catch an opponent who's about to die, you can get them with that running attack like it's nobody's business. That's one of the weaknesses of the ultra weapons on this list. I mentioned the Great Club. The Great Club has a very slow running attack. So if your opponent's running away, you can swap over to like a dark S-Stock if you wanted to. You can swap over to any number of finishing weapons like a dark longsword, but you don't have to do that with the Harald Curved Greatsword. Your opponent has like 400 health left, which is actually a decent chunk of health. You just chase them down with the running attack and it's all over. Now, on top of all that, it has a very useful weapon art. The weapon art is short range, but it comes out immediately and has a ton of hyper armor. You can actually keep it going if your opponent isn't smart enough to roll out of it, and if you use the last jump on it, that just does so much damage. It's so ridiculous. So it's got everything you want for invasions. It's got a powerful neutral R1, it's got a powerful neutral R2, terrific jump attack, it's got the excellent running attack that allows you to finish opponents off, but also to harass the group, and then it has access to the Chaos Dagger and the Hornet Ring, which means if you guard break somebody, they're dead, right? So this weapon just about took first place. I really had to debate it. I think you could consider it a first place weapon, but I did put it into second place in favor of a different weapon. So second place, I've got nothing negative to say about it, Harald Curved Greatsword. Okay, and before I reveal first place, I just want to do a few honorable mentions. First off, I want to mention that crossbows are an exceptionally good harassment weapon. You can also actually use whips to hit through walls as well, but they're not going to be used as primary weapons, so they don't make the list. Then we have Demon Scar. Demon Scar is absolutely deadly, especially if you can get the opponents to split up and allow you to duel them. As I mentioned before, there is just one thing holding it back. If you're fighting a competent group of players, you're lacking Tears of Denial, you're relying on your Ashen Estus actually making it throughout the fight. You need to get a kill to replenish your Ashen Estus, and I honestly feel like that does hold it back. On top of that, of course, it doesn't have any poise, and it can be pretty hard countered by the Black Iron Shield or even the Black Knight Shield. So when you're fighting groups, all that stuff matters. I also want to mention the Twin Axes, which you can infuse them to dark, and they actually get surprisingly good range, but also surprisingly good damage. The damage is just shocking on these weapons, reaching easily into the 1200s. I do think that, once again, like the Demon Scar, if you can get your opponents to split up, this weapon will shred through them, but in an actual fight versus a true gank squad, you will probably be outplayed. You're not going to be able to get the full L1 combo off without being shot by a mage in the background, right? And you're going to be dealing with a lot of long-range poise weapons like the Farron Greatsword and the Ring Knight Ultra Greatswords. So I do like the Twin Axes. I think that they score high as an invasion weapon, but there are just safer ways to engage your opponents. Finally, I want to mention Gale's Greatsword, which I think is a terrific weapon and also scores very well as an invasion weapon, most of all because of its 3-piece combo that can deal around 800-900 damage. However, I do think that it is surpassed by Mad King's Crucifix and by Splitleaf, and that keeps it off of the list. So basically, just like Leto's Great Hammer, just like the Exile Curved Greatsword, you just had better options to choose from. So it's a great weapon, don't hesitate to use it, but I'm going to recommend the Dark Splitleaf and the Mad King's Crucifix rather than the Gale's Greatsword. Alright guys, well it's time to reveal the number 1 weapon on my list. And how many of you already suspected that it would be the Greatsword Ultra Greatsword? That's right, I remember playing in the arena one time against a random who just kept beating me with this weapon, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out how the hell I was losing. And of course, there was a point where I started playing around with the FUME Ultra Greatsword, and that's why I really developed that technique where you block with the Ultra Greatsword and you get right up in your opponent's face and tempt them to attack you, right? Tempt them to attack you while you're blocking, or catch them while they're trying to roll away, or just force them to be in a constant state of trying to react to that Ultra Greatsword, right? It was around that time that I really started to think about the Greatsword, Ultra Greatsword, and there was something I didn't like about it, believe it or not. It wasn't necessarily the fact that it gets a Great Hammer rolling attack, which, by the way, is a very weak rolling attack. I just don't use it. And it also wasn't the fact that the Stomp weapon art wasn't that good either. It was the R2. I didn't like the R2 on the Greatsword, Ultra Greatsword. I always felt like it was a weaker R2 than that terrific thrusting attack on the FUME. And oh boy, was I wrong. You know, I actually used the FUME and the Greatsword, Ultra Greatsword recently back to back, and I can tell you without a doubt, the R2 on the Greatsword, Ultra Greatsword is the best Ultra Weapon R2 in the game. It's very comparable to the Great Club's R2 in the way that opponents don't always know when to dodge it, or how to delay their dodge. That's because the beginning of the swing comes out pretty fast and it lasts for the whole horizontal arc of the swing, with the very last part of it still having active frames and your opponent possibly rolling right into those active frames. Essentially, your opponent can roll too late on the right side of you or too early for the left side of you. And the reason this matters is because that R2, besides having this huge horizontal hitbox, it has the highest R2 range of all the Ultra Greatswords, right? So they don't necessarily escape it by rolling backwards. They kind of have to roll to your left or your right, but guess what? if you've gotten really good with the R2, you can start to rotate it and do some really weird things, like hit opponents who rolled behind you with the end of that swing. It's really, really crazy. And so when I took it finally back into invasions for the second time, for a nice long bout of invasions, I found myself a lot more competent with the weapon, because since then, I'd used the weapon extensively in duels in the old Wolf Arena in a PvP ladder, right? These were actual, I would call them try-hard duels, right? So I had a lot of experience with the weapon, but also I just had a different appreciation and understanding of Ultra Greatswords. And so going back into the invasions, using all these strong weapons, I really feel like the Greatsword, Ultra Greatsword, has something special going for it. It's not the rolling attack, of course, don't use that. So the weapon art R2 on this weapon is surprisingly good at getting opponents to clear off of bridges. They know what it is, they see the spin move, and they either dodge it incorrectly, which gets them knocked off a bridge, or they get hit by it, which gets them knocked off a bridge, or they successfully avoid it, which protects you. There is a rare case where a very skilled player can actually roll into you during the weapon art R2, and that's why it's critical. If you use it, make sure you use it from full stamina so that you have enough stamina to roll away if they successfully roll into you for a punish, okay? Make sure you have enough stamina. Do it from full stamina. So the weapon art R2 is a room and a bridge clearer. Second, the R2 on this weapon, as I said before, has a huge horizontal arc. It allows you to catch all kinds of opponents who are trying to jump around you or trying to get behind you. It's very hard for them to do this because the move protects you, and if you've gotten very good at the timing, you can really, really punish people who are trying to roll away from you and spread out. So, unlike the FUME, when opponents spread out, you have to be really, really picky about who you hit next. You have to hit whoever the aggressor is next, you have to hit them next. But with this weapon, because the R2 is this huge, huge hitbox, you really just let it go at the right time and it totally protects you, right? So now you've got the nice vertical moveset, but also you have this R2 that punishes opponents who try to spread out and surround you. Now on top of all that, I do have to point out you can infuse this weapon to dark, which means you can bring the Chaos Dagger with you if you even need it. You can bring the Hornet Ring with you, and anytime you guard break somebody, you're going to one-shot them with the Chaos Dagger. Also, it doesn't use as much stamina, which I find that really useful as well. So I think I've said everything I need to say about the Greatsword, Ultra Greatsword. I hope you'll consider giving it a try. I do consider it the best invasion weapon in the game. You know, it's got those really powerful drop attacks that those fast dual weapons just don't have. It is able to one-shot those opponents who still have a lot of health left, is able to knock opponents off of bridges to their death, all kinds of good things going for this weapon when you're fighting a gang squad. So first rank, Greatsword, Ultra Greatsword. And with that being said, this video is officially a very long video. If you watch the whole thing, kudos to you. I do appreciate it. If you think the information in there was useful, consider giving me a like, consider giving me a comment. You know, that's how these videos rank on YouTube, basically. And I did work very hard on this. And of course, if you want to see other useful tier lists, maybe I'll make one for gang squads. Just tell me what you'd like to see. I don't mind. Whatever it is you want to see, I'll work on it. Alright guys, well that is going to do it for me. I'll see you all next time.
Really? Oh my gosh, you guys! I just want to thank y'all so much!